Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, insiders at Montana Rail Link reflected on the railroad's operations after they'd been found not negligent for the Alberton derailment. We now continue with Part 6, Chapter 26, Rough Spot. Epigraph. And another thing I forgot to state is that rail had been turned in 3 times before the spill happened. And now, that should have never happened. Billy Schutter. The day before Ted Lyon's closing arguments, I asked if he knew about Billy Schutter's November 2000 testimony to the EPA Ombudsman that a rough spot on Curve 155 was turned in 3 times to dispatch by 3 different train crews. Lyon was taken aback. No, I didn't know about it. That's the first time that it's ever been called to my attention. Did you miss his testimony? Lyon asked Michael Yesasaga, his assistant who attended the hearing. Yeah, I guess so, Yesasaga said. Perhaps he had left the room. If so, apparently no one on Lyon's staff later read the transcript of the hearing. Someone took notice because the next day, a Sunday, Schutter got a call from someone representing themselves as being from the EPA, though Bob Martin verified that his office did not call and no one else associated with the EPA attended the hearing. It was probably somebody from MRL, Lyon said. No, I had no knowledge of that. Boy, that would have helped us a lot in this case, if we knew that. A massive understatement. And if he, Schutter, won't tell you who it was, then you're dead. I think that's probably more likely than not to be true, Lyon said. Lyon was speculating as he processed the information. Even if they are retired, they're frightened to death of them. I mean, we talked to several people that hate them, and they are frightened that they will screw with them on their retirement, Lyon said. Lyon never pursued Schutter's allegation in court. On railroad matters, Billy Schutter's position on the Alberton grapevine lay close to the roots. Did the father of the assistant engineer have accurate information? During the Austin trial, Billy Schutter declined a personal interview. He assured the media after the first few days of the spill. On the record, he and engineer John Caswell said they experienced no problem with Curve 155 on April 9 during their outgoing trip west, and Schutter also denied hearing that any other train crew had noticed a problem. Whoever his source was, Billy Schutter declined to reveal them. But his was a startling allegation that no one, not the media, not plaintiff lawyers, not Martin's office, ever investigated. Except for the mysterious caller, when someone purporting to be with the EPA asked Schutter questions about his family's exposure history. When I asked Schutter if rough track on Curve 155 had been officially documented, he said, I don't know, the engineers just tell them, the dispatchers, that they've got a problem. As for any confusion with the Knoxon derailment the same day, Schutter said, they said that spot there, Curve 155, had been turned in 3 times, and the one at Knoxon 5 times. Schutter said that when the EPA called him, they also asked for his son Billy's unlisted phone number. Billy Schutter had not testified at the hearing. In the Griffin case, MRL stated, the record shows that none of the 52 trains passing over Curve 155 between its last inspection before the derailment on April 8, 1996, and the derailment 3 days later gave any indication of a detectable defect immediately prior to the derailment. 16 trains went over Curve 155 on April 10, the last 5 running by at 5:50, 7:45, 9:15, 9:50, and 11:30 p.m. On April 11, there was a 12:15 a.m. train and then the 4:07 a.m. train that derailed. Schutter claimed 3 train reports. MRL attorneys claimed not a single train crew reported track problems at Curve 155. MRL put on the record testimony only from one engineer, Rick Bitts, from the 12:15 a.m. train to back up their claim that there was no evidence that that train crew notified MRL dispatch of any irregularities at Curve 155. They did not produce dispatch transcripts, if any existed. When asked in court if any train crews reported a rough spot on Curve 155, Augie Cantu replied, I don't remember any. A certain precedent was revealed in the Noxon derailment of April 11. Lee Schutter said he'd heard Noxon had been reported 5 times. Billy Schutter said he and Caswell reported the Noxon rough spot and had heard it reported over the radio by other trains over about a week and a half. When it apparently hadn't been fixed by April 11, they didn't bother to report it again, and no one had put out a slow order as MRL policy dictated. There apparently was no archival documentation of reports to dispatch because Chief Engineer Keller said in court there had been a, quote, question as to whether the Noxon rough spot had been reported or not. He didn't know. In his earlier deposition, however, Keller said that after a train reported a rough spot a few days prior to the Noxon derailment, the roadmaster had a joint raised up, an easy fix. Then the night before the derailment, he said, another train again reported a rough spot at Noxon, prior to the Caswell-Schutter train. And Keller said MRL came to the conclusion, quote, it would last until morning. MRL decided to let it go until morning and without a slow order. An emergency crew could have made night repairs, but MRL operated a bare-bones day crew. Though MRL may have earlier made some effort at response by raising a joint, a precedent was established that rough track continued for many days after initial reporting and that no slow order was posted. On April 11, a train derailed at the Noxon spot at high speed. The track did not last until morning. Similarly, engineer John Caswell claimed that in 1995, a rough spot on a bridge was reported every day for a month and a half. At track speed, 60 miles per hour, he said, it would actually throw you right out of the seat. Caswell claimed MRL said they didn't know what the problem was, and when they finally checked it, they found bolts missing. By comparison, Caswell said, I reported things on the Burlington Northern, and within an hour it is actually a slow order. Citing Noxon, Griffin plaintiffs argued that the overall track was in such poor shape that only the worst problems got reported, and even they didn't always get a timely fix. Did MRL experience 2 derailments on the same night involving rough spots that had both been reported? Since Noxon had been put off to morning, not even slow ordered, could the same have happened to Curve 155 if reports came in late on April 10th? If Noxon had been an ongoing problem for several days, what if Curve 155 had just begun to be reported? In Lee Schutter's hearsay, he claimed Curve 155 had been turned in 3 times, which could have made the 9:50 p.m. train on April 10 the first reporting. If this were true, any inspection was put off until morning. Based on MRL's recent history and alleged practices at the time, this wasn't a far-fetched supposition. Based on Noxon, heavy freight traffic, worn rail, and short-handed overworked crews, deferring rough track maintenance appeared to have become the accepted norm. Crossed fingers and whistling in the dark. Keep the freight moving. Heavy traffic was the same argument plaintiffs used in alleging delayed curved rail relays, but delay of needed repairs was a much more serious charge. Was Curve 155 called in 3 times beginning late on April 10, and did someone at MRL decide it could wait until daylight when the regular shift could check it out? Such a scenario was speculation, built on the Noxon precedent, the general track problems MRL was experiencing, and of course, Lee Schutter's uncorroborated hearsay. It stood against MRL's flat denial that no crew turned in the rail. Even Billy Schutter testified he had not heard differently. Rick Bitts, engineer on the last train prior to Caswell and Schutter's, testified he felt and heard absolutely nothing. MRL expert Gary Wolf reported that no crew reported hearing any, quote, gunshot noises, as would be expected if a piece of rail had already broken out prior to the Alberton train. The batter at the failed rail's fracture line only proved that some wheels went over the loose head before the foot-long field side piece broke off, as the head moved up and down on the rail along the fracture line. But something had made a loud noise, according to witnesses. Some residents that live closest to the spill site on Plateau Road, they all wished to be anonymous, reported hearing unusual noises as trains passed through on April 10, 1996. Resident Blue's household heard sounds with 2 trains passing before they went to bed, the first being approximately 9 o'clock. I actually got out to go and investigate because we thought somebody was banging on the side of our house, Blue said. But it was repeatedly, and again it happened later around midnight. It was a metallic bang, but it also sounded like somebody was hitting the side of the house, too. These times corresponded with any of the last 4 trains prior to the derailment. Blue associated the rhythmic noise that echoed off the house with the wheels of the railroad cars passing a given point. It was constant, Blue said. It was like, I don't know how else to explain it. It was like somebody hitting something with a hammer, but hitting your house at the same time. It was like you could hear it, but you could feel the vibration from it at the same time. Blue claimed to have told their lawyer about this. Blue had also heard rumors that MRL was aware of the rough spot and were supposed to slow down to a certain speed going around that curve until it could be fixed, Blue said. Blue is certain this information pertained to Curve 155, not Knoxon. Many years after the derailment, Plateau resident Gray remembered few details, but recalled weird noises sometime on April 10. The train has just like a normal sound when it goes by, Gray said, and if there's something different in there, you kind of notice it. It sounded more like there was a gap in the track, like the track was sinking too far at a point. Kind of like as it would go by, chung chung, chung chung. Plateau resident Red reported a similar story. That slapping, banging noise? Yeah, we heard that, Red said. Red thought they noticed it sometime in the afternoon of April 10, when a train passed. Just a constant banging, and just every time the weight got on it, you could hear it bang, Red said. Red lived further away and didn't get the reverberation against their house like Resident Blue did. Oftentimes, Red didn't even notice when a train went by, but this noise was unlike any Red had ever heard before. It was like your clickety-clack noise, but harder and louder, every time the axle went over it, Red said. At that distance, the noise didn't strike Red as anything serious. Red also heard rumors about Curve 155 having been turned in for a rough spot. As a matter of fact, Red said, I asked a friend of mine that runs the train, and he said that he'd known about it, heard about it through the other engineers. He said he had heard that it had been turned in. Red's friend was a current engineer at MRL in 2001, but Red would not give his name. I'd better not. He's still working for them. I don't know if he'd get in trouble or not. Resident Green, who had a relative working for MRL, had also heard rumors about rough track being turned in. You know, Green said, everybody directly involved on the railroad knew about it because that's where the rumors came from to start with. Green believed the rumors. Oh, I'm sure it was true, because they jumped from 4 trains a day up to, at that time, I think they were running 30 trains a day through here. MRL said 16 trains passed on April 10, 1996. And it's quite obvious when you're running that many trains, you can't work on the track as much as when you're only running 4 trains a day, Green said. Living nearby, Green saw that they weren't working on the track like they had been before, he said. It wasn't maintained like it should have been for as much traffic as they were having on it. Green also claimed to have heard a rumor that a slow order had been issued on Curve 155 prior to the spill. That's what they were talking about until MRL got all their people to shut up, Green said. Green knew an MRL employee who was about ready to retire, and they flat out told him, if you say anything at all, you'll lose your retirement and everything else. There was no indication that the derailed train was running slow as it entered Curve 155. In fact, expert Robert Rainey felt that the 42-mile-per-hour train speed as they approached the curve indicated that the crew was being pushed. At track speed, crews might not have heard the rough spot, but they would have felt it. Had the rail with a vertical split head started to fail in the last few trains prior to the derailment, leading to the catastrophic failure at 4:07 a.m.? MRL flatly denied that a Curve 155 rough spot had ever been turned in, and plaintiffs never produced a statement, firsthand or hearsay, from anyone claiming that the track had been turned in, or claiming to have heard unusual sounds on April 10. One plaintiff said their lawyer tried to talk the former roadmaster, Roger Babcock, to no avail. What made Lee Schutter's statement remarkable was that it was the only time anyone associated with the spill made public an allegation of the track having been turned in, though that allegation was publicly ignored outside the Ombudsman hearing. The allegation had been already well known in Alberton, at least among people with some connection to MRL employees. Schutter tearfully testified, "I'm not supposed to say anything, but my son's totally disabled." Not directly under the thumb of MRL, Schutter had opened up in the cathartic release of the hearing. But what wasn't rumor, what wasn't hearsay, was the private testimony of Plateau Road residents hearing a rhythmic, metallic hammering as trains passed through Curve 155 late on April 10. Bang, 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 like an iron gavel. The implications of whether MRL had foreknowledge of a problem with Curve 155 were immense if they failed to act on that knowledge. Initially, it would have meant negligence and very likely punitive damages, the latter not covered by insurance. An obstructive cover-up could have resulted in criminal charges. MRL lawyers said MRL had known nothing, and no evidence proving otherwise was produced in court. A speculative reconstruction of April 11 through April 14, 1996. Connecting the dots may explain seeming secrecy regarding the spill site. As background, the FRA determined MRL had, quote, a worn rail problem by June 1996, following 3 vertical split head related derailments in 6 months. As the unexpectedly high freight traffic year of 1995 continued into 1996, the FRA documented many worn curves that MRL failed to add to the 1996 relay season. In addition to many extra curves, MRL added themselves for relay following an unusual check in early 1996, resulting in an 83% increase from their original plan. Curve 155 had already been scheduled in 1995, then labeled uniquely as, quote, ball worn out in MRL's extraordinary January 1996 curve check. Half an hour after the Alberton derailment, MRL suffered a bad derailment at Noxon. Train crews and Lee Schutter claimed that a rough spot had been turned in several times for over a week, and MRL eventually responded by raising a joint bar. Following another report on April 10, MRL decided the Noxon rail could wait until morning for further inspection, setting the precedent that MRL, beleaguered by rail problems during another busy freight year and short-handed due to crew reductions, had trouble maintaining rail repairs, as verified by employees. MRL had also failed to issue slow orders for some bad or worn rail, except at the behest of the FRA after their curve inspections. Lee Schutter, father of Assistant Engineer Billy Schutter, alleged to the EPA Ombudsman that a rough spot on Curve 155 was reported to dispatch 3 times by train crews prior to the derailment. Anecdotally, several residents claimed they later heard that a rough spot had been turned in as well. Several Plateau Road residents reported hearing gunshot or hammering sounds generated from passing trains late on April 10, suggesting a bad rail or missing piece. In their litigation defense, MRL denied knowledge of a Curve 155 rough spot and claimed no train crews reported bad rail. Rick Bitts, lead engineer on the last train prior to the derailment, testified in court that he had no knowledge of a rough spot. No other engineers testified. No dispatch records were produced in litigation. If MRL were telling the truth, they had no foreknowledge of bad rail on Curve 155, ignoring the Sperry internal rail test in March, which showed an anomaly at the later point of derailment, but which Sperry and MRL apparently did not notice. If Schutter's allegation were true, MRL potentially faced liability charges, punitive damages, and even criminal negligence and obstruction. If the rough spot allegations were true, and if MRL decided to wait until morning to check on the curve and make any repairs, as they did with Noxon, they would have strong incentive to conceal the truth after the devastating derailment. MRL would have had to convince employees with direct knowledge not to testify to knowledge of a rough spot. Anecdotally, in general, MRL employees reported fear of losing their jobs and pensions if they spoke out against MRL. Additionally, because of profit sharing, significant losses incurred by MRL from the derailment could affect all employees, further pressure to not testify. Such manipulation wouldn't be surprising, given that MRL was later sanctioned in court for withholding evidence about rail wear on Curve 155, and the unaccountable disappearance of the A rail with a vertical split head seen by the FRA in Keller's office. If the allegations were true, MRL would also have had particular incentive to control the derailment site, which evidence suggested they did. Once MRL dispatch confirmed the exact location of the spill just after 5 a.m., logs show no indication that 911 or responders were made aware of the information. Missoula Hazmat did not know the location as they went on recon at 7 a.m. at daybreak and said that MRL was not communicating with Hazmat. Yet, they heard en route as they searched that MRL was already at the site. MRL appeared to want to get to the site first, possibly in part to look for evidence of the failed rail. Regardless, by not communicating the location, MRL put responders and residents in potential jeopardy, while generating unnecessary confusion. Meanwhile, around 4:45 a.m., Scott Waldron met the engineers at the Petty Creek crossing. When asked if he verified the spill location, Waldron said the engineers told us about where the derailment was, but I didn't place a whole bunch of relevance on where the train was. It wouldn't have mattered if the train derailment was 100 miles away. We were dealing with where the cloud was and what evacuations needed to take place, he said. Alberton Fire Chief Tim Ishler said much more directly that the engineers said that the derailment was actually at Natural Pier Bridge. But nothing is mentioned in the logs of Incident Commander Waldron reporting the location to 911 or other responders, and 911 continued to send people to the wrong location and tell residents the wrong location. Waldron unconvincingly dismissed any importance to the site location, claiming defensively that all that mattered was the location of the cloud. Not communicating the location to 911 jeopardized responders and residents. Waldron also spent close to an hour at Forward Ops after he relocated to the 9-mile Exit County shop and was with Hazmat's Jess Mickelson. I.C. Waldron surely knew that Missoula Hazmat's Fiddler and Ziegler were searching for the site on their recon attempts. Yet, he didn't share the site location to aid and protect them. To speculate, it made no sense for Waldron not to share the site location with 911 and Missoula Hazmat. If he contacted MRL to verify the location, or if MRL contacted him, the incident commander, possibly MRL convinced him not to report the location, arguing that the response and evacuations were underway, and MRL would be responding to the site. This would give MRL time to get to the site first and do an initial assessment regarding any obviously accessible damaged rail. This is speculation, but it could explain MRL's and I.C. Waldron's behavior of not telling 911 and Missoula Hazmat the location. Otherwise, Waldron's excuses suggest gross incompetence, and MRL's behavior inexplicably irresponsible and suspicious. MRL's assessing the spill and mobilizing the technical response was important, but the chlorine response at the site would take many days to unfold. And such response needs did not explain MRL keeping Missoula Hazmat in the dark and then stonewalling federal involvement. Speculating, MRL's biggest immediate concern was the failed rail, if a rough spot had been turned in the previous night and left to wait until morning. The initial control of the site by MRL was followed by a 3-day shutout of federal agency oversight, which gave MRL time to more closely examine the site and rail. The EPA said locals denied access and the state didn't request access, and the two were connected. On-scene coordinator Tien Nguyen said Waldron repeatedly refused access, citing safety reasons. Waldron claimed both safety reasons as well as too many people wanting access. Unconvincing rationales for denying federal agencies such as the EPA, Coast Guard, and the National Transportation Safety Board, who all had jurisdiction and top hazmat credentials. Jim Green of the Montana Department of Emergency Services and Tim Murphy of the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation were the main state-level responders with the State Emergency Response Commission. Murphy later claimed that Governor Mark Roscoe told him on April 11, after declaring a state of emergency, "Don't let the feds take this over." Murphy said the following morning he met with MRL owner Dennis Washington and Roscoe in Missoula. After Roscoe and Washington held a brief private meeting, Murphy said Roscoe reiterated, "Don't let the feds take this over," and that Washington said he would cover costs. Green's impression was that Washington feared losing control of costs. This reiterated demand suggested that Roscoe and Washington had already talked the previous day. But Washington's alleged concern over controlling costs seemed an unlikely true motive for stonewalling the feds, since federal involvement was inevitable and the EPA typically allowed corporate mobilization of resources with EPA oversight, which is what happened. The logical and really only way for Murphy to implement Roscoe's edict was through I.C. Waldron, though Waldron never admitted to this. Waldron was the only one empowered to, quote, "not let the feds take this over" at the scene, and he made sure they didn't for 3 days. Some state and local officials seemed to support the federal shutout as a sort of turf fight, wanting to prove that they could handle the response from an incident command perspective. They would have been unaware of any ulterior motives of MRL and Washington regarding failed rail, being willing participants in promoting what state and locals could do in emergency response. Governor Roscoe, however, a former Montana Attorney General, chose to abet his friend, regardless of what Washington told him. During these 3 days, MRL seemingly overlooked a dead body. If they had found the body, and they probably should have, reporting it would have jeopardized site control. While Missoula Hazmat made a few visits after they found the site, they were of brief duration as they videotaped the toxic cars, with MRL on hand, and Missoula Hazmat quickly realized that they had no expertise to control and remove the remaining chlorine. Federal agency eyes, including the NTSB investigator, were another matter entirely. They would scour the site. On the 4th day, the feds gained access, and the EPA quickly found the body. MRL maneuvered over 3 full days to control the site. The only clear advantage seemed to be to give them time to search for damaged rail, a concern especially heightened if a rough spot had been turned in and left till morning. A surprisingly large amount of the failed rail went undiscovered, and some was lost and even disappeared. A railroad is made up of people. The men and women who work the long shifts, who oversee, maintain, and ride the rails, whose families often live near those very tracks. So many other people had fled choking in terror that night. So many others suffered illness for the rest of their lives. One had immediately died. If the allegation of the track being turned in were true, no one came forward to give witness. If the allegation were true, the death of the Milwaukee would be only the second biggest betrayal to Alberton. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Under pressure from the failure to find Montana Rail Link negligent in court, most of the remaining cases settle, including Lucinda Hodges' family. Looking back over the past 5 long years, Hodges shares the chronic health impacts of her family's exposure. Until then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.